In 1956, Jack Parshall faces one of the most challenging air crash investigations of all time.
When you talk about an accident in the Grand Canyon, you're talking about both hostile, inaccessible, remote, and dangerous.
Hot enough to melt aluminum. This was the age in which accident investigation began to grow up.
Now, let's see what we got in the DC-7.
The world expects answers from Parshall.
Right there.
The consequences for getting it wrong in any respect could have tremendous negative ramifications for this fledgling industry.
Parshall makes a frightening discovery about commercial aviation. It isn't safe.
It's not a matter of the system being broken. Guys, we don't have a system.
Los Angeles International Airport. United Airlines Flight 718 is preparing to depart for Chicago. The DC-7 is the newest and fastest passenger plane in America, the pride of the United Fleet.
I'm sorry, sir, there's no smoking until after takeoff.
In 1956, airline travel is something few people have had a chance to experience. There are only 117 commercial aircraft in the entire state of California.
The girls were off, bound for New York. They were walking on air even before they got on board.
Flying had a panache about it. Now, part of this was because it cost a lot, and there was a level of exclusivity about it, but there was also a level of civility about it.
Expertly prepared and tastefully served.
It was a special deal.
A DC-7 can carry almost 100 passengers non-stop from coast to coast.
It was no longer a situation where people said, well, you're going to go fly commercially? You're putting your life on the line. It was getting to be reliable. It was getting to be, if not ubiquitous, then fairly common.
Chicago for dinner, gentlemen.
Dinner can't come soon enough for me.
Door closed and secure, guys.
The DC-7 is powered by 4 huge engines. Each one has 18 cylinders. The Wright 3350 turbo compound is a technical marvel, but it demands a lot of attention.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard United Airlines 718. Our captain today is Bob Shirley. You're in good hands.
48-year-old Captain Bob Shirley has more than 17,000 flight hours. He's been on the Plum LA-Chicago route for nearly a year.
Bob Shirley was an excellent pilot.
Clay Lacey is a former United pilot who was with another crew flying out of Los Angeles that morning.
He was highly regarded as a pilot, and he had his own airplane, and the guy loved aviation.
TWA is running a little late this morning, huh?
Mm-hmm. The 36-year-old first officer, Robert Harms, is a World War II veteran and a former flight instructor.
Well, we're on time, guys. Let's keep it that way. I'm 3 pages into the checklist.
The third member of the United Airlines cockpit crew is flight engineer Gerard Fior.
Engine number 1. RPM's 2100.
The flight engineer was a busy fellow, and he fine-tuned the power plants individually and even by cylinder.
Checking magnetos. Left. Both. Right. Both. RPM is good for left and right.
The proper heat, mixture controls, and cowl flaps, and so on and so forth, to keep those power plants running at their best.
Cylinder head temps are in the zone?
Well, Dr. Fiore, we are less this morning.
She's all yours, Captain.
While the United crew waits to taxi, the tower controller gives instructions to the plane ahead of them, a TWA flight to Kansas City.
TWA-2, cleared for takeoff on runway 25 right.
Roger, copy, cleared for takeoff, 25 right.
United Flight 718, taxi to position and hold. You are next on runway 25 left.
United 718, copy, taxi and hold. Runway 25 left.
The United flight is right on time this morning. Keeping to schedule is important in the small but growing air travel business, where many flights carry at least some first-time passengers.
As they kept adding flights, passengers kept coming. It was almost an if you schedule it, they will come situation.
United Flight 718, cleared for takeoff.
Takeoff clearance obtained.
Takeoff thrust.
80 knots.
Check.
120 knots. V1. Rotate.
At 9:04 in the morning, Flight 718 lifts off from Los Angeles. The trip to Chicago should take about 6 hours. Captain Shirley must follow an assigned corridor through the airspace around Los Angeles. After that, he's free to fly wherever he wants, as long as he reports passing a series of waypoints along the route to Chicago.
If you had to divert, it was no real big deal. We did not have the sophistication of the radar equipment we have today. Back in the 50s, there was a big sky up there, and that was kind of the way everybody thought of it. There weren't that many airplanes up there.
Can I offer you something to drink, man?
Engines sound good, Mr. Fiore. How's the temps?
Hold steady, skipper. Slow running a little, Rich.
We were very interested in those days in pleasing the passengers.
Well, time for some introductions.
Knock yourself out.
Good morning, folks. Captain Bob Shirley here. It is a beautiful, bright day. We're almost at our cruising altitude of 21,000 feet, which is almost exactly 4 miles.
If only 10% of people had flown, we were certainly trying to get more people to fly. So just try to make it a fun, interesting experience.
54 minutes into the flight, the DC-7 reaches its second waypoint.
United 718. We're at Needles. 958. 21,000 feet. Clear skies. Course direct to Durango. Estimate crossing the Painted Desert Line at
10:31.
10:31.
The crew will next check in when they cross a point on the map known as the Painted Desert Line.
I'll try to get you some spectacular news in the next half hour, so let's stay glued to those windows. Just crossing into Arizona. On the right, you can see Lake Havasu. Where we are, it's about 10 below zero, so go rolling down those windows now.
Cruising at 21,000 feet, the crew spots thunderclouds ahead and adjusts their course.
Back in those days, if we'd see a thunderstorm head or a line of thunderstorms, we'd turn and try and go between two of the cells. And without radar, we didn't tell anybody. We'd just steer around.
Folks, we got a little weather, so if you get a bit bumpy, nothing to worry about. Just keep your eyes peeled and look at the spectacular view no matter where you're sitting. How are we doing on your side?
Thunderhead 5 miles south. We're clear of it.
Shocked passengers have no idea what's gone wrong.
Oh, God! Bang, 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 bang! Come on, baby, come on!
United Dispatch to United 718. Do you copy?
Flight 718 is overdue to check in. Calls from dispatch go unanswered.
United Dispatch to United 718. Do you copy?
Air Traffic Control Headquarters in Salt Lake City.
CA Salt Lake.
Controllers here don't normally communicate directly with flight crews. They get flight information by phone from airline dispatchers who are in radio contact with their pilots. At 10:51, they get a disturbing call from United Airlines dispatch.
Salt Lake. Understand. United 718, 20 minutes overdue at Painted Desert.
Moments later, another dispatcher calls. More disturbing news.
Salt Lake, TWA. I'm getting no response from Flight 2.
Understand, TWA. Flight 2, 20 minutes overdue at Painted Desert. We have had no contact here.
Controllers now know that 2 planes flying from LA have not reported crossing a scheduled waypoint, the Painted Desert Line. United Flight 718 and TWA Flight 2 to Kansas City were both expected to reach that waypoint at 10:31.
CAA Salt Lake, TWA Flight 2, do you copy?
In the absence of a radar beam hitting an airplane, if the airplane disappears, you're not going to know that anything is wrong until probably the second time that they fail to hit a reporting point. They're supposed to get on the radio and report their position.
TWA 2, CAA Salt Lake, do you copy?
TWA Flight 2 is carrying 70 people. There are another 58 aboard the United flight. Controllers and dispatchers can only wait for some response to learn their fate.
I had a trip that morning in a DC-6 from Los Angeles to Denver. We got over Bryce Canyon about the same time that Air Inc. was calling United 718.
CAA Salt Lake, do you copy?
Maybe twice a minute that they were trying to get a hold of him. And I remember Slim, who was Bob Shirley's boss, he says, that Bob isn't listening to the radio, you know.
More than an hour has passed since the planes were last due to check in. Controllers send out a bulletin asking local authorities to keep an eye out for the two missing planes.
In Painted Desert, that's where you expected to hear from at least one of those two airplanes. When neither of them were heard from, that's the time that the hair is going to begin to stand up on the back of the heads of the controllers.
Two commercial airliners are still missing somewhere over the Arizona desert.
Finding an aircraft in those days, before we had various locator beacons, before we had the radar systems that we have today, indeed was looking for a needle in a haystack.
The next morning, news comes from authorities in Arizona confirming everyone's worst fears.
They found him?
The remains of two different planes have been spotted in Arizona's Grand Canyon.
There was a gentleman named Palin Hudgens, who was an air tour pilot, who had heard that there were missing airplanes, and he was flying along looking at anything he could see down there, and he sees some smoke coming up from Char Butte.
The twisted wreckage of United 718 lies on a rocky ledge, 210 meters up the sheer canyon wall. The air tour pilot spots the second crash site, on the floor of the canyon about 2 kilometers away.
He banks around, comes in for a closer look, and there is the most distinctive structure in commercial aviation at the time. The tail of a constellation with the 3 prongs. There's just no mistaking that.
We had one aircraft up on a bluff. We had pieces down in crevasses, engines and parts lying in various places.
The immediate priority is to get rescuers into one of the least accessible places in North America.
When you talk about an accident in the Grand Canyon, you're talking about both hostile, inaccessible, remote, and dangerous.
Richard Rodriguez is a former investigator with the Civil Aeronautics Board.
You're 1,000 feet above a riverbed, for instance, depending upon where you are. So it's a very dangerous place to work.
When rescuers finally reach the crash area, they first find the scattered remains of TWA Flight 2. Reaching the wreckage of the other plane will be even more difficult.
These are mountaineers from Denver's Rocky Mountain Rescue Club. Near the rim of the Grand Canyon Gorge, they collect their gear. These mountaineers will attempt to scale the steep walls from the floor of the canyon in order to reach an abutment on which rests the shattered wreckage of the United Airlines DC-7.
It's not long before rescuers come to a grim conclusion. Everyone aboard both planes is dead. It is now up to investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board to piece together what happened.
The Grand Canyon is a graveyard for 128 passengers and crew of 2 airliners which crashed on peaks little more than a mile apart. The impact reduced the wreckage to carbonized smears of paint and metal. None survived.
The sudden loss of 2 of America's most modern airplanes shocks a country that has come to think of air travel as luxurious and safe.
We were not familiar as a people with having massive tragedies like this and a huge body count, especially in this fledgling thing called commercial aviation. We were used to an airplane crashing every now and then. It was a fairly common occurrence, but not 2 very safe airliners.
Air accident investigators are shuttled to the crash site by helicopter.
The investigator, of course, is driven by a desire to know what caused the accident for the simple reason that we want to prevent it from ever happening again.
The team's lead investigator is well suited for the job. Jack Parshall is an aviation legend. Not only an experienced pilot, but a crash survivor himself.
This was one of the pioneers. This is a guy who's flown airmail. He's done it all over the years, and he's also had 4 crashes of his own. You would want if somebody exactly like this on the job of trying to piece together the dynamics of a crash as well as piece together the metal.
All right. Let's figure out what's what. Start mapping this up.
The pieces on the ground will tell Parshall what happened in the air.
Folks, we've got a little weather, so it should get a bit bumpy. How we doing on your side, buddy?
Thunderhead 5 miles south.
Could a sudden thunderstorm have produced turbulence violent enough to knock both planes out of the sky? Jack Parshall doesn't have any of the advanced technology or the considerable body of knowledge that modern-day investigators have come to rely on.
It was night and day between the tools that the National Transportation Safety Board has now and what they had then. It literally was a different world. They had very little.
Broken fragments of the plane and his own expertise are all he has to solve this mystery.
What's left of the cockpit?
There were no black boxes like there are today. It really was a buy the seat of your pants situation. And in fact, this was the age in which accident investigation began to grow up.
Hot enough to melt aluminum.
At the TWA crash site, Parshall finds evidence of an intense post-crash fire. But that doesn't tell him what brought the plane down.
Where's a connie's tail from here? Okay, let's take a look.
Investigators locate the constellation's distinctive triple tail, about 500 meters from the rest of the plane.
Well, well, well.
The distance tells Parshall that the tail came off the plane before it hit the ground. If he can figure out why the tail came off in midair, he'll be one step closer to finding the cause of the crash.
Check this out.
The wreckage of TWA Flight 2 shows clear evidence of a catastrophic impact. The plane's skin has been shredded. Parshall also finds small streaks of blue paint.
I'm gonna need this brought up to the hangar.
On the canyon floor 700 meters from the constellation lies a piece of the other plane. The DC-7's wingtip is streaked with red paint and is nowhere near the rest of the plane. It also came off in midair.
It was a smoking gun. When you find red on an airplane that has no red, that pretty well proves the point that something happened up there that was not part of that airplane as it took off from Los Angeles. This was one of the things that cinched the deal.
The evidence points to an incredibly rare, almost unheard of event.
They definitely still have some paint up there.
It wasn't severe weather that brought down 2 planes from 2 of America's largest airlines.
Damn! What's he doing there?
It was a mid-air collision.
For a DC-7 crew to look up and see a white constellation right in their face, first of all, there's going to be a nanosecond or 2 of absolute, complete disbelief.
Oh, God! Back, 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 back! Come on, baby, come on!
Muscle memory kicks in for any experienced pilot, and that's when the yoke gets grabbed and thrown in whatever direction, raising the wing, trying to get out of the way. But the dynamics at that point in time are too late.
The collision over the Grand Canyon is one of the most significant accidents in the history of commercial aviation.
It was an earth-shaking event that took place there that day.
What Jack Parshall uncovers through his investigation could affect commercial aviation across the country. Already certain there's been a mid-air collision, he now needs to figure out exactly how the 2 planes collided and why.
Can we get that piece over there, please? Thanks, guys.
Parshall has to recreate the final moments of the 2 flights based on bent metal and streaks of paint.
It was one heck of a challenge to match those 2 aircraft up and come to a deduced conclusion as to what happened. They start to look at models in a mid-air collision to put things together and figure out could this wing have interfered with this horizontal stabilizer, etc.
Now, let's see what we got in the DC-7.
To try and build a scenario that matches some of the minute clues that they may have, like impact marks, like paint transfer marks.
Take a picture, please.
The paint transfer evidence tells Parshall that the DC-7's left wing hit the Constellation from behind.
It was obvious that the DC-7 had probably overrun the Constellation from the right rear side. Had come apart, literally, knocked the tail off.
The Constellation plummets towards the Grand Canyon more than 17,000 feet below. United 718 has lost half of its left wing, but not all of its engines.
What's the damage? Number 1 engine is out. Airspeed 260. On level out. 8,000 now.
Anyone that survives a mid-air collision is luck. Because it depends on what the damage to their airplane. You have to have enough left to control the airplane.
Less than a minute after the collision, TWA Flight 2 slams into the canyon floor. In the DC-7, Bob Shirley and his crew struggle to avoid the same fate.
Come on, pull up, pull up! This airplane is going to be rolling rapidly to the left, and it has no control.
Parshall now understands the mechanics of how the two planes collided. But he still doesn't know why their flight paths crossed. They were supposed to be flying different routes at different altitudes. They should not have been in the same place at the same time.
Damn! What's he doing now?
Parshall now needs to know how that happened.
Today, the only 3 bodies found from the United Airlines plane were brought up by helicopter. Here, Army, CAB, and airline officials talk over future operations as this somber announcement is made. That next Monday, a single reverent burial service in 3 faiths is planned at Flagstaff, Arizona for the unidentified victims of the 2 planes.
This crash in the Grand Canyon startled everybody and galvanized the country. I would just imagine that Parshall was very cognizant of the fact that this was probably the most critical investigation he had ever been involved with, and that the consequences for getting it wrong in any respect could have tremendous negative ramifications for this fledgling industry.
Investigators continued climbing through the wreckage of 2 passenger planes that collided over the Grand Canyon.
Jack Parshall reviews the plane's flight plans.
So they both start the day at LAX.
United Flight 718, taxi to position and hold.
Let's see. 718 was cleared Green Airway 5 out of LA, direct to Palm Springs Junction, to Needles, then on to Painted Desert Line, here, 21,000 feet. TWA was cleared Amber Airway 5, Green Airway 2, direct to Daggett, and crossing Painted Desert Line at 19,000 feet.
Neither one of them should have been over the canyon.
It's clear both planes diverted from their original flight plan. But Parshall knows that's not uncommon.
What you would find pilots doing is they would file a flight plan along the airways, and once you get airborne and you're more or less out of the heavy congested area of an airport, then you refile your what you really want to do, which is direct here, direct there, direct someplace else.
With no cockpit voice recorder to help them, investigators turn to radio dispatch recordings and transcripts. The radio calls between the pilots and their company dispatchers may hold clues about the routes the 2 planes actually took that day.
United 718, we're at Palm Springs Junction. United 718, we're at Needles, 958, 21,000 feet, clear skies.
It's the last one they reported.
Course direct to Durango.
Estimated crossing the Painted Desert Line at
10:31.
10:31.
They had 33 minutes to get there, so how come they never made it?
To answer that question, Parshall needs to learn more about the movements of the other plane, now lying at the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
Let's see what TWA did.
TWA-2, cleared for takeoff on runway 25 right.
Roger, copy.
Cleared for takeoff, 25 right.
TWA Flight 2 took off 3 minutes ahead of the United flight in a different direction. It was to fly northeast, towards its first checkpoint, Daggett.
TWA-2 en route to Kansas City, passing Daggett at 19,000.
Roger, TWA-2, 19,000 at Daggett.
The TWA pilot was Jack Gandy. With 15,000 hours as captain, he was nearly as experienced as United's Bob Shirley. Gandy knew these skies well. He'd flown this route nearly 200 times.
Good morning, TWA dispatch, TWA-2.
We've got a little bit of weather here we want to get on top of.
Be a good man and ask Salt Lake to clear us to 21,000.
Roger, TWA-2, requesting clearance at 21,000 feet.
So, TWA asked for 21,000. So Salt Lake clears them?
No. Request denied due to conflicting traffic.
Advisory, TWA-2, unable to approve 21,000 due to traffic.
That's a no-go on 21,000.
United 718 is there.
Captain Gandy wants to avoid the clouds in his path, and in 1956 he has another way to accomplish that.
Let's just get on top of this stuff.
He uses visual flight rules, or VFR.
Roger that. Advise Salt Lake I'm going to VFR and 1,000 on top.
Salt Lake, TWA-2, requesting 1,000 on top.
Maintain at least 1,000 on top. Advise TWA-2 his traffic is United 718, direct Durango.
The TWA crew was cleared to fly 1,000 feet above the clouds, but warned to look out for United 718.
Well, they used to have a procedure to operate 1,000 feet on top. It meant you stayed 1,000 feet away from clouds, but you stayed in the clear, and you were supposed to be VFR, looking around for traffic.
So, at Daggett he asked for 1,000 on top. That's all fine. So where does that get him?
His next report is from Mojave at 9:59.
TWA-2, passing Lake Mojave, 1,000 on top at 21,000. Estimate Painted Desert at 10:31.
Half an hour after requesting 1,000 on top, Gandy reports his actual altitude.
21,000 feet. Now they're both there.
They could fly at any altitude they wanted as long as it was 1,000 feet separation from those clouds. So they took 1,000 on top and then selected to fly at 21,000 feet.
Investigators now understand how the TWA flight ended up at the same altitude as United 718. As for why both planes diverted from their scheduled routes at the same time...
Damn! What's he doing there? Pull up!
The answer is the crash site itself. An awe-inspiring natural wonder.
Let's give him a look, shall we?
Hi, Captain. It was common making a few turns over the Grand Canyon to show people the Grand Canyon. I mean, that happened every flight because the Grand Canyon is such a spectacular sight.
Wonderful sights to see way down below. The Grand Canyon, for instance, one of the 7 wonders of the world.
Sightseeing in terms of what you could show to the passengers was something that really lit up the senior flight crew. I can actually show you something that nobody else can show you. I can dazzle you with things that you, as an ordinary human being who doesn't fly, would never see.
Just keep your eyes peeled and you'll get a spectacular view no matter where you're sitting. What are we doing on your side, Doc?
Thunderhead about 5 miles south. We're cleared it.
Okie dokie. You've got some room.
You were free to, if you wanted, deviate a little bit for sightseeing. That you could. It wasn't dangerous. Nothing dangerous about him.
Damn!
But on June the 30th, 1956, it proves fatal.
Oh, God!
Jack Parshall needs to find out how such a common practice killed 128 people.
From the very beginning of aviation, we had the concept of see and avoid or see and be seen. The responsibility for separation of aircraft was still the pilot's responsibility.
Parshall knows that United hit TWA on the right side, coming from behind. One of the pilots failed to see and avoid. Parshall needs to figure out which one.
What's he doing there?
The answer will lead to sweeping changes in the rules governing commercial aviation.
Let's see what Captain Shirley can see out there.
Using a scale model of the DC-7 cockpit and airspeed estimates for both planes, Parshall tries to calculate the distance at which the United pilots could have first spotted the constellation.
What were the views of the flight crew members from each one of the aircraft? Could they have seen each other? Did they try and avoid each other?
So if they ended up like this, let's go back a couple of minutes.
Those are the kinds of things that that investigator in charge, I'm sure, was asking himself and getting his team together to try and deduce from the evidence.
We'll need you over there.
Investigators begin to suspect that there may be serious problems with the whole idea of see and avoid.
Hey, keep going. Keep going.
Let me tell you one of the dirty little truths of commercial aviation from the 50s all the way to now. We have been under see and avoid, but you can't see, in most cases, even to avoid. And that's because the windows are very small.
All right, keep going. A little bit further. Keep going. Stop. Come back half a step. Right there. That's where Shirley would have first seen the Connie.
Since the DC-7 was behind the Constellation, it was Captain Shirley's responsibility to avoid it. Parshall wants to find out if he had enough time to do that.
There are basic rules, and those basic rules are to, indeed, if you see an impending situation, the overtaking aircraft will give way to the aircraft in front.
The 6 pilots in both planes were preoccupied with the demanding job of flying their aircraft.
You had a piston plane, you had the throttles, you had the propeller, RPM, to adjust your RPM.
It didn't sound good, Mr. Fuhrer. How'd the tanks?
Steady, Skipper. Slow down, Rich.
There's really a lot more to do flying a piston airplane.
That'd be 53 miles.
Parshall's test shows that in theory the Constellation would have been visible to the DC-7 crew when it was 85 kilometers or 53 miles away. The numbers suggest that Captain Shirley had 2 full minutes to avoid a collision. That's more than enough time to safely change course.
Damn! Oh, God! Come on, baby, come on!
Parshall needs to know why that didn't happen. The answer becomes clear when he reviews the radio recordings.
Dispatch, TWA2. We've got a little bit of weather here we want to get on top of.
Be a good man and ask Salt Lake to clear us to 21,000.
On June the 30th, the skies over Arizona were not clear.
Folks, we got a bit of weather over the canyon, so it could get a bit bumpy. Nothing to worry about.
How we doing on your side, Bob?
Thunderhead about 5 miles south. We're good.
Okie dokie. We've got some room.
They were flying, I hate to say fat, dumb, and happy, but in effect that's a phrase we use when you think everything's copacetic.
When he factors cloud cover into the equation, Parshall reaches a stunning conclusion. The crew of Flight 718 had just seconds to recognize and avoid the plane ahead of them. Boom. The collision was unavoidable.
You have seconds to respond, to identify, to develop or formulate a evasive maneuver and execute it, and for the aircraft to respond to any control inputs that you put in there.
There was no indication in the heads of any of the pilots on either of those 2 flight decks that they were in proximity of anybody else in a dangerous way until they came around a cloud, and all of a sudden the DC-7 crew has a Connie right in their face. And the Connie crew, I'm sure that they, to the moment of death, had no idea whatever hit them.
When Jack Parshall sits down to report his findings, he faces intense pressure. The reputation of an industry hinges on what he has to say.
We're really there to try and prevent the next accident, a recurrence of similar circumstances that set up an accident. But certainly with the high death toll, 128 people died that day, 2 major airlines of America running into each other, there was a call to find out who was guilty, who was to blame.
The obvious conclusion is that the pilots were to blame.
That's a no-go on 21,000. United 718.
A lot of people want to lay the blame on TWA's captain, Jack Gandy.
Roger that. By Salt Lake, I'm going to VFR at 1,000 on top.
It was Gandy's decision to switch altitudes that put his plane in the path of United 718. But a strict interpretation of the rules would put the blame on United pilot, Captain Bob Shirley.
Damn! What's he doing there?
In a perfectly sterile analysis of this, the overtaking aircraft, the one who's overtaking the other aircraft, has the legal responsibility of avoiding the aircraft they're overtaking.
Right there.
But Parshall's calculations have shown there was no way for Captain Shirley to avoid the collision.
I think it's not only fair to say that these 2 crews were following the rules and doing everything the way that they understood it should be done.
21,000 feet. Now they're both there.
But that this was the way society in aviation viewed the proper way to do it at the time.
There is one last possible culprit. The air traffic controller who told TWA about the United flight, but didn't advise the DC-7 crew about the Constellation.
maintain at least 1,000 on top. Advise TWA2 his traffic is United 718.
There was an attempt to throw blame in all directions. Very human, very understandable. By the same token, when it came to the blame put on the air traffic controllers, it was very misplaced.
With no radar coverage, air traffic controllers could not visually track flights. It was impossible for them to advise every company dispatcher on the precise location of every plane in the sky.
I think if we try and pin the issue down to who was to blame, we're probably looking at this accident in an inappropriate way.
It has become clear to Parshall that no one person is to blame for the mid-air collision.
Those two aircraft were put in the proximity of each other by the rules and the regulations.
The real cause of the crash is something much bigger, something that goes to the very heart of aviation in America. Jack Parshall concludes that blame for the Grand Canyon disaster lies not with the pilots, not with the controllers, but with a completely inadequate air traffic control system.
The subtext in that report had to be very delicately placed in front of the Congress and the American public, but the subtext is very clear, and that is, you know, it's not a matter of the system being broken. Guys, we don't have a system. This is a great non-system of air traffic control, and until we get a handle on that, we are not going to be able to rise to the level of assurance of separation in any degree that the public is obviously expecting.
The Grand Canyon crash and Jack Parshall's report provoked dramatic changes in American aviation.
As a result of the event in the Grand Canyon, something new was born. And there was a new awareness to the public's right, desire, and interest in air travel. And that was fostered by lots of very innovative designs and traffic collision avoidance systems that are present in today's environment.
The main outcome of the Grand Canyon collision is that the United States now has a nationwide radar system. Controllers can now track the movements of planes in even the most remote parts of the country.
The only way you're going to assure that this will never happen again is if you've got somebody positively controlling whoever's up there to where they cannot get too close to each other. They can't change altitudes at the right time. You can't mix the traffic. And that meant radar coverage across the entirety of the country.
Despite all the advances, air traffic controllers still face challenges. More planes in the sky, flying faster and higher than ever before. And though extremely rare, mid-air collisions still do occur. In response, aviation officials are developing a system that could transform air traffic control in America. The Next Generation Air Transportation System, or NextGen, will use GPS satellites to give pilots the precise location of the traffic around them. By the year 2020, pilots will know exactly how close they are to all other aircraft, without air traffic controllers having to tell them.
Hopefully the next generation of air traffic control will look back on that event of the Grand Canyon, and we'll try and get ahead of it before such another tragedy does recur.
As the era of romantic air travel fades into history, the lessons learned from the Grand Canyon disaster remain. Flying can always be made safer.
I'm reminded constantly, anytime I study an older accident, of something that was said by George Santayana in 1917, an American philosopher who said those wonderful words, "He who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it."